All right, I'm going to begin with a reading from Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sins. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Surely you desire truth in the innermost parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. So we come together on a Friday, once a year, of course, to remember and to, in many ways, rehearse that Friday some 2,000 years ago. And most of us who are here have probably been through this routine before, right? We kind of know how it works. And we know, thank God, we know that we're in Friday, but we're moving towards Sunday. And that celebration, resurrection, life out of death, that hope that we hold deep within us, we know we're moving to that place. We know the shape of the Easter weekend. But nevertheless, on this day, we gather with some intentionality and kind of say, yeah, but with all the hurt, with all the suffering, with all that's going on, we need to hang out here in this spot for a little while, remembering and putting ourselves in the shoes of those followers of Jesus who themselves had that agonizing wait from Friday through Saturday, where they had much less hope than maybe we do before getting to that Sunday. So this is arguable. I don't know if there's any Steven Pinker fans, but I've been listening to a couple of podcasts this week, surprise. And probably, so one of the things I've heard, this theory, and I think there's something to it, is that the time we live in right now, and probably the place too, like Calgary, Canada in 2019, is probably one of the best places and spaces to be alive in human history. If you're, so basically, why would people say that? Well, life expectancy is higher. Global poverty is still real, of course, but is much lower by some measures than it's ever been before. Violence and war, we know, still exist, and we hear about these things much more because of, we have the world at our fingertips and our smartphones and televisions and everything else. But overall, it seems that violence and war are less and less despite the extremities. And we have longer life expectancy, we have better medicine, we have surgeries for everything, we live great longer lives, we've got drugs that fix everything, some drugs that don't. So of course there's terrible things that in the world that happen, but in a general sense, this is one of the best times to be alive in human history. Maybe you're optimistic like that. I'm optimistic. Painfully optimistic. I don't know how many people were part of the Enneagram study that we did recently. So I'm a 7, so I'm optimistic to the point of there is no pain. What pain? We shut off the pain. We ignore the pain. We make it go away. In any case, however we gauge that, whether we're at the best time to be alive and we're painfully optimistic, or maybe we see more pessimistic things, or maybe in our own lives we think, yeah, it seems like the best time to be alive for everybody else, but what about me and what I'm going through and everything else? Nevertheless, however we gauge ourselves in that spot, we are among 7 billion other people on this planet who right now have the same death sentence hanging over our lives. All of us, right? Every single one of us. And every single Good Friday, I quote Hank Williams, "No matter how I struggle and strive, I'll never get out of this world alive." Death is that reality. We know that. And we know that death is a reality, but more than that, we know that these things that remind us of death, hurt and poverty and struggle and depression and anxiety and marginalization and injustice and war and domestic violence and sickness and racism and persecution, all these things that remind us of death, and this death sentence hangs over all of us, and it bothers us. Of course it bothers us. It bothers us, so we prefer to concentrate on other things. Death is a reality, fine. We have to come to terms with it eventually, but we don't like it. It makes us angry. It frustrates us. It hurts us, and it makes us grieve when we see death close in others because we want life. Of course we do. That's our deepest desire. Our deepest desire is to have life, to have it to the full. We want to have lives that are purposeful. We want to have lives that are full of meaning. We want to give love, and we want to receive love. We want joy, and we want life. So why, God, are we in a world where death is this reality that hangs over all of us? Why are we here for such a short time? One generation after another. Even if there's less suffering now than before, there's still too much. Why is there so much suffering? Why death? And why is it that though death is something that we all have in common, it doesn't unite us? It actually makes us feel more alienated and alone and by ourselves. Where are you, God, in all of this? And I think that question, maybe we don't always articulate it that way, but is why we come back year after year after year to this death, this particular death. And it's not because it was the most violent or painful, although Mel Gibson would like you to think that it definitely was, but it probably wasn't the most violent or the most painful death. And it's not just because it was unjust. There are plenty of unjust deaths, and of course it was unjust. And it's not just because resurrection is coming, and we know that Jesus rose from the dead, although it would be a completely different story if that wasn't the case. But I think we come back to this death, this Friday, again and again, year after year, because of who? Because of who it is that undergoes this suffering and this death. When we look at Jesus, we are looking at the revelation of God's self, God's heart, infleshed as a human being. At the cross, we see a man suffering, and at the very same time, we see God suffering, God weeping, God betrayed, God accused, God mocked, God dying, and God put to death. God and man, human, put to death. When we see Jesus, we see God. This is what God looks like. This is what God's heart is like. And we identify with Christ in his suffering. We identify with him as a human being who is knowing suffering, and we are human beings who know something of suffer. But we also, in doing so, this gift that Good Friday is to us, we're identifying with God himself in that place. And we're invited into this beautiful mystery that is the whole thing of the incarnation, that God somehow attaches himself, his own identity, to the human race, and attaching forever our identity as human beings with the identity of God. What a deep mystery. You could sit for 24 hours straight and just contemplate. How can that be? That amazing love that we sing about. That now every suffering, every hurt, and every death is one that Christ and God himself identifies with us in. So we're going to look at the story. I'm going to give an overview of the story. I'm going to hit some of the elements and probably miss a few of them. But hopefully this will be an introduction to our own reflections as we go from here into the rest of this evening, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and hopefully come back to a new experience on Easter Sunday. So last Sunday was Palm Sunday, of course. Jesus and his disciples were staying in a little town called Bethany, Bethpage, just out of Jerusalem, with close friends, Mary and Martha, and of course Lazarus, say that 10 times fast, who Jesus raised. And there must have been considerable anxiety among the friends and followers of Jesus. For some, probably that anxiety expressed itself in excitement. For others, in fear and maybe a little bit of both, uncertainty, confusion. They knew they had come to this place. They were just on the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem, where they were going to the Passover feast, this once-a-year feast. And this is a week that's bigger in the year than the Calgary Stampede or some festival like that, right? This is a huge deal. This is more like Woodstock, but it was expected, where Jews from Judea and from Galilee, but also from Egypt and from Syria and from Turkey and all over the Mediterranean world would show up in this city. And literally hundreds of thousands of travelers would all descend on the city of Jerusalem for this Passover week celebration. And Jerusalem, even in the first century, was a tightly, densely packed city. So you can imagine it was quite a show. The energy must have been palpable. And what were they celebrating? Well, celebrating Passover for that whole week that started this week, right, on Sunday, they're celebrating God freeing his people from bondage and oppression in Egypt. Meanwhile, once again, their identity as Jewish people at this time and space in the first century is once again as occupied people under Rome. So that builds a tension in itself. And of course, Rome is present in the city with all kinds of military strength and might, and they allow this religious festival to take place to avoid uprising. But the festival itself is, if I can put it this way, it's a bit of a middle finger to power. Like it has a subversive element to it, right? Revolution is in the air a little bit. It always was at Passover week, and oftentimes it popped up and was put down very quickly by the Roman power. I was thinking one time, I think it was in 2000, this is a weird aside, but I'm going to go there anyway. So I went to, you can ask me why later, to a protest of the Democratic National Convention. Actually, I'll tell you the why. The why was because Rage Against the Machine was playing there, and Ozo Motley was playing there. So I was new. Sherry and I had just moved to Los Angeles in 2000, and I went to this kind of outdoor event, little protest outside of the Democratic National Convention, and there was like LAPD everywhere, but not just as cops. They were in their full riot regalia, like the shields and the masks and everything, holding batons, and they were ready, and they had their pepper spray and everything, and they were just present in this place. And eventually they did throw, they thought for whatever reason it was getting violent, so they threw canisters of pepper spray, and whoa, that was, you felt that, and then it was time to go. And I remember walking back to my car on this downtown LA street, and on one side of the road on the left, there was all cruisers, cop cars, with the passenger window open. And then on the other side, just standing against the wall on the other side of the sidewalk, were these cops in full riot gear, like just in a line. And there was probably 50 cars in a row, and I had to walk through that back to my car. Anyway, I just kind of think about that intensity, that fearfulness. That's a scary place to be in, where you have like powers and authorities, and there's this something happening. And this is just my experience was just a little tiny thing. The city of Jerusalem was a powder keg of all kinds of tension and excitement and possibility and revolution in the air. So here you've got at least 4 different groups. Let's say you have Jewish pilgrims, who are the religious folks, right, who want to remember and celebrate, as they're called to do, this deliverance that God gave them from Egypt. Then you have those among the crowd who are radicalized, I guess, who are waiting, wanting, just can't wait for something to bubble up because they're going to join in because they just hate the oppression that they experience under the thumb of Rome. Then you have the Roman military contingents all over in different places of the city. They're watching carefully, and they're waiting for anything to go sideways because they will put it down quickly and violently. And then you've got the temple authorities, the Pharisees and Sadducees and that group, who are kind of in between. They are also sort of in their religious selves hoping for God's deliverance, but they also don't want the boat to be rocked because that could make them lose their place in the temple and as the authorities in the religion. So this powder keg of excitement, of tension, of everything else, is what for the last month or more Jesus has been intentionally steering himself and his disciples toward. So in the Synoptic Gospels, you keep getting this statement that Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. He set his face towards Jerusalem. Like he was intending, this is the place where I'm going. He said it to his disciples over and over again. And they know that he's led them to this place. And very clearly in the gospel accounts, the disciples are still confused right up until Easter, really. Well, actually even past Easter. Actually, the whole time, the disciples are confused. What exactly is Jesus doing? What is his program? What is this person who we're following all about? And of course, last week we looked at Jesus entering the city with fanfare, but also weeping with sorrow over it. That line that kills me every time is, "O Jerusalem, if you only recognized the time of your visitation, but you didn't, and you don't." That always hits me in the heart a little bit because I don't want to miss the time of Christ's visitation or being blind to that. May it never be. Open our eyes, Lord, to recognize your presence even among us. So Jesus enters the city. He goes to the temple, another symbolic, powerful act. He chases out the money changers. Again, the stakes are high. This is a dangerous place to be. And just so you can appreciate how tense the atmosphere, going on and on about this, must have been, is it was 40 years later, just 40 years later, that a Jewish revolt did erupt in the city, and the Romans did crack down. And there was, at that time, on this weekend, there was a crucifixion of 3 people. At that time, the Romans were crucifying up to 500 people a day and basically leaving bodies strung up across the hills. So the danger's real, right? And Jesus has these 2 symbolic acts, walking with a donkey, cleansing the temple. But then the next days, he continues to raise his voice in the public square, in the temple courts. And he talks about judgment resting on the temple system and the religious system. And he says some cryptic things like, if the temple is destroyed, he will build it up in 3 days again. And the crowds are getting stirred up, and the Pharisees and religious authorities are challenging him, but he keeps schooling them with the kinds of things that he's saying as this week goes on. They ask him about Caesar and taxes. He's wise, and he's challenging them on every point. And now there's some disagreement, believe it or not, there's always disagreement when it comes to biblical scholarship on what day the Passover itself actually was on in this week. Was it on Saturday, the Sabbath? Then there's also questions, well, was the Last Supper a Sabbath presentation or a Sabbath meal, a Seder celebration? You know, John kind of presents it a little differently than the synoptics. In any case, probably it was a Passover meal. Probably Jesus and his disciples were celebrating it earlier than the rest of the city. And at least a few details are laid out pretty clearly. First of all, the disciples and Jesus are staying, they're now in Jerusalem, right? And they're staying at an upstairs room, a room above a house. And that was kind of a common thing in Israel, Palestine in the first century. You're staying somewhere, but you could have family members. You'd have an upper room, and you could have family members up there. You could rent it out, a large room where you could have a gathering, etc. A little bit of an aside: the Greek word for that upper room is kataluma, and kataluma is the same word for. Remember when Mary and Joseph are looking to, but they found no room in the inn. The word is kataluma. Only 2 places it gets used in the New Testament, that upper room. So it's kind of not really like Motel 6 or anything in the Christmas story, but okay, or in this story. Anyway, so it's a kataluma, it's an upper room. Jesus speaks to them. In the Gospel of John, we see he does this beautiful act of washing his disciples' feet. He humbles himself, takes out his outer garments, shows his deep love symbolically to them, and he's going to show it more than symbolically very soon, but by washing their feet, by honoring them, by serving them, by loving on them. And then Jesus said, I've been eagerly desiring to eat this meal with you. That's the verbiage in Luke. And the word is epithumeo, and he actually says it twice, like epithumeo, one of them's a verb form, but it's this double constructed. It's the same word that actually means like lust, Like so in the Sermon on the Mount, when if your eye causes you to lust, tear it out. It's that same word, epithumeo, and it just means deep desire. So he's like, with deep desire, I've been deeply desiring to eat this Passover meal with you, his disciples. Jesus is passionate at the outset of the Passion, talking to them. They go to the table. They're reclining at the table on couches, and these couches in the first century are usually like two-person couches, and that's just how they did it. They relaxed and reclined. Wouldn't you like to do that at supper time? And dip your bread, and it says that, you know, one of the disciples was resting his head against Jesus' chest. They're in this comfortable place. They're at table together. They're probably having all kinds of different conversations. They're having some wine. They're dipping in bread. It's social. It's friendly. It's a family time. Jesus predicts, again, that he is going to be betrayed. Probably not everybody heard it, although a few said, "What? Not me. Surely not me, Lord." And then he dips his bread into the same jar as Judas does. And then Judas, the one who's going to betray him, leaves. He's got something to do. Near the end of the meal, Jesus takes bread, probably something he's done every time, again and again over the last 3 years they've seen him do. He gives thanks for it, and then he breaks it. The word for thanks, by the way, in Greek, this is my third and final Greek word, is Eucharist. Eucharist means giving thanks. Thank you, God. Thank you, God, for this, what you've given. Thank you, God, for these whom you have given. But then he does something unique, and he says, "This is my body, which is for you." A little note is he doesn't say, "This is my body broken for you." And in fact, John's gospel actually kind of highlights the fact that Jesus, as the Passover lamb, does not have broken limbs. "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then after supper, he took the cup and he poured it out. Now, if this was a Seder kind of celebration, this is probably the fourth cup of wine. That doesn't mean they have to drain it to the bottom every time, but I'm just saying it is the fourth cup of wine. He tells them, and he tells you, and he tells me, "This cup is the cup in my blood." What does that mean, Jesus? This is the cup of the new covenant, a new arrangement between God and human beings. Do this in remembrance of me. And they don't understand, but they will remember, and we remember. And then after supper, Jesus says, "Let's go for a walk." And they leave, and Jesus talks. And Jesus talks a lot. And in the Gospel of John especially, it's beautiful to read those at one setting, is just to read all the words that Jesus has to say to them. Remain in me. I've loved you. Hang on to that. I'm going to leave you for a little while, but I won't leave you alone. I'm the vine. You're the branches. Remain in me. Abide in my love. You're going to have trouble. Lots and lots of trouble, but I won't leave you alone. And they walk further, and they go to this garden, a large green space that's just outside of the city, right by where he came into the city. They're walking, and then Jesus prays for them. He prays for his friends, his disciples. And he prays for all of those who will be called his followers. He prays for you and for me. And then he calls out just a few of the disciples, and he says, "I need some more time to pray." And that was kind of depicted beautifully in that video with the stones. Peter, James, and John, come with me. Guys, I'm hurting right now. Can you wait here? Can you hold vigil? You pray, and I'm just going to go on a little further and pray. And he does. "Father, if it's possible, I don't want to do this anymore. Your will be done." And then he has those tears like blood, and coming back, they're sleeping. 4 cups of wine, right? And he says, "Friends, couldn't you stay up? This is my hour of deep need." Once, twice, 3 times it happens. Once, twice, 3 times they fall asleep. And the last time he says, "Come on, let's go. this is happening. And there in that garden, Judas shows up with a crowd of temple officials. They're armed. Judas kisses Jesus and greets him, "Rabbi, teacher." For a minute, the disciples are going to fight, especially Peter. He takes out his sword, but Jesus tells him no, and they arrest Jesus. They bring him to Caiaphas, who's the main religious denominational authority, and his soon-to-be successor, Annas. And when he's in that place, a few of the disciples scatter, but Peter, for one, kind of follows behind. And the first denial happens when somebody outside of Caiaphas and Annas' place think they recognize him as one who was with Jesus. He denies it. Jesus then is brought before the Sanhedrin. Now, this is the group of not just Caiaphas and Annas, but this is the group of all the Pharisees and Sadducees. And all kinds of accusations are brought before him. He's accused especially of blasphemy. Blasphemy by claiming to be a son of God, but especially that blasphemy against the temple, where he claimed that he would tear down this temple and build it again in 3 days. And it becomes an all-night affair. These accusations lead to mockery and abuse. And then by Friday morning, he's before Pilate. And Pilate, you've probably heard of, has some reservations. Pilate is the Roman official, and the Roman official is the one who has to give their blessing, so to speak, for a crucifixion to happen. His wife has had a dream. He says no. He tries to appease the crowds because there's crowds now gathered around. They're calling for the crucifixion of Jesus. He says, what about Barabbas? He's been an insurrectionist, a murderer among you for much longer. Let your bloodlust rest on him instead. But they don't go for it. He tries to wash his hands of the whole event, but eventually he is sentenced to death. So Jesus is beaten more. He's mocked more. Again, it's been an all-night affair, Thursday night leading to Friday. He's forced to carry that large crossbeam, through the streets of Jerusalem to a hill outside called Golgotha, or the place of the skull. And some of the accounts have accounts of some of the women following him through the city. And when he stumbles and falls, there's this guy, Simon of Cyrene, who helps Jesus and carries the cross on his behalf. There's more scenes, and then he's put up with these other 2 accused men on the cross. A sign is put above his head that says, "The King of the Jews." Some people complain to Pilate and say, "Why don't you put the sign that says he claimed to be the King of the Jews?" Pilate says, kind of cryptically, it says what it says. Men below are gambling for his clothes. And as he's being put on the cross, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And he's in this place which is an agonizing death, right, of asphyxiation, when you can't hold yourself up anymore and you slump down and can't breathe. It's agonizing, it's long, it's terrible, and that's the intent of it. At one point, he's offered drinks that he rejects. The 2 criminals on the 2 sides of him, one mocks him. It's kind of an ironic thing to do, right, when you're dying next to someone, to mock the other guy who's being accused and dying. But the other one rebukes that one, and Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." There's another scene. His mother and the disciple who Jesus loved, probably John, are there, and he sort of blesses them. "Hey, from now on, you guys take care of each other. That's the way it's going to be." At one point, Jesus cries out that heart-rendering cry that maybe we can identify at the lowest parts of our lives. "God, why have you forsaken me?" It's both a quote of a psalm, but also the heartfelt cry of God himself feeling abandoned of God. "Why have you forsaken me?" Mocking comes in. He's calling Elijah. Well, let Elijah come and save him. Then, roughly at 3 o'clock, after 3 hours of crucifixion, he breathes his last. And the scripture tells us the sky goes dark, and there's thunder. The curtain in the temple rips into. A centurion standing at the cross says, "Surely this was a son of God," or the Son of God. And at sundown, it will be Sabbath. And they need to have the bodies taken down by then, so they go to break the bones. Here's that breaking again. Break the bones of the crucified if they haven't died yet, to kind of hurry things up a bit because they have to get these bodies down. But Jesus is already dead, so they put a sword in his side, and water and blood flow out of that. Later, his mother and followers and Simon of Cyrene again take his dead body and lay it in a tomb. And that, in their place, where they were at that moment, might have been the end of it, with shock and trauma and horror, the one who they had followed, the one who they had put all their hope in, now lying dead in a tomb. Now again, we know that this isn't the end of the story, right? Thank God we have this place to be in, but we have Sunday that's coming. But this part of the story, another reason to linger in this part of the story, is that this is the part of the story where so many in our world, in their lives, in their experiences and suffering, this is the part that they live in. This is the part that they experience. And Jesus as crucified, again, that beautiful mystery of God refusing to be God without including humans, and his taking our humanity into his own self. Jesus puts his voice, Jesus puts God's voice, God's concern in his crucifixion, in his suffering, with the marginalized, with the oppressed, with all those who are abused, with all those who are sick and in pain, with those who are emotionally distraught, with those who are spiritually distraught. That's where God puts himself in the crucifixion of Jesus. In all those places where there are suffering, Jesus says, and I am with you. You know, it's often said that the book of Job is the Old Testament's answer to the problem of evil. Why so much pain and suffering? And the answer you get at the end of the book of Job is kind of, listen, it's way bigger than you can ever understand. It's a mystery. But in the cross of Jesus, it comes one step further, and it says, why, when we ask the question, why all this pain, why all this suffering? Well, there's still a lot of mystery there, but I'm with you in every little bit. I take it all on myself. I don't just leave you to do it.